I want to start by talking about some of the inventions that shape the lives we as humankind have today. So let's start with clean water and sanitation. Since 1990, 2.6 billion people have obtained access to a cleaner water source globally. At that run rate, it will be another 2,000 people before I finish speaking with you today. Vaccination. In the last 30 years, the percentage of infants vaccinated against diseases like tetanus and whooping cough has grown from about 40 to over 85%. Smallpox is gone. Polio is almost gone, and many, many others are on the run. Antibiotics. My grandfather was born in Ireland in 1897, and as a young man, he got a small infection under his fingernail that just got completely out of control, and his arm had to be amputated. Today, entirely preventable with antibiotics. So these are just a few of the things, along with access to energy, that give us the lives we know today. And we've made enormous progress worldwide at ensuring the world's poorest people gain more and more access to these basic services that many of us in the developed world take for granted. Now, we'll talk more about energy, a topic I care deeply about. It's important because 80% of the world's population now have access to electricity. And that number has grown enormously over the years as economies have developed all over the world. And it's key because, as you can see, energy use per capita is very highly correlated with GDP per capita. And we see the opposite effect when we look at energy use per capita and the correlation with share of the population in extreme poverty. So in plain language, having access to energy drives economies forward and vice versa. And that means more people with more money in their pockets that allows them to go and be empowered and get access to the basic goods and services I just described that improves their quality of life. And that includes things like smartphones with data plans so they can go and watch this TED Talk. What a wonderful story. But there is a problem. 3/4 of global energy demand today is provided by fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. Global reserves of these fuels are absolutely enormous. And estimates vary on this a bit, but global energy demand between now and 2050 is likely to decline a little or grow a lot. And that is a big problem because, as all of you know, we have this enormous threat of climate change, and the global carbon budget is incredibly important. As an international community, we've signed up to a climate change target of just 1.5 degrees. And unfortunately, it's unlikely that we'll get there. If we take an extreme scenario, if we were to burn all the fossil fuel reserves I mentioned a moment ago, the climate could warm by 18 degrees in the coming 3 centuries. Even taking a less extreme scenario, missing the 1.5 degree target is a big, big deal. So you'll be sitting there and asking yourselves, is there any good news? Well, there is. Renewable energy prices continue to fall exponentially. And I mean fall beyond what any of us in the industry even thought just 2 years ago. It's absolutely incredible. Renewable energy generation is now the cheapest form of new electricity generation. Fact. It just keeps falling and falling. And we know that renewable energy generation will be the largest share of new electricity generation to be added to grids worldwide because it's getting cheaper and it's getting better. And that includes technologies such as batteries, electric vehicles, and other technologies designed to help integrate renewable energy into the grid. Will all of that be enough? Probably not. Our politicians are balancing what is possible with what is affordable, with what's acceptable. But unfortunately, while it's moving in the right direction, it's just not getting us there. And this is why we need to be worried. So this is a study that was released recently that looked at, as you get warmer temperatures and longer heat waves, you get to a point where people die from heat stress today. This is not some futuristic picture. This is happening right now. in a part of the world home to over 1/5 of the world's population. If we don't get this under control, we will have major problems because human life is not compatible with heat stress. If we were to get warming of, just say, 10 degrees, the area of land made uninhabitable due to heat stress would make the area of land made uninhabitable due to rising sea levels, which we always hear about, look small. So we need a different approach to tackle this huge global problem. And I'd like to go back to some moments in history to examine moments of change and look at this problem in that context. So in 1215, King John signed the Magna Carta. And that was the first step in putting power into the hands of the people. Prior to that, feudalism was the model, where whatever the king said went. The king could lock you up or kill you or whatever. Jump forward a few centuries to the 1600s, and Europe was at war. And following that, the concept of nation states and international law was created. The idea was that nations should have sovereignty over their borders and domestic affairs. And around the same time, the early forms of the modern corporation were emerging, where nations created companies such as the Dutch East India Company. So what you can see is the concept of the consumer citizen, the nation state, and the corporation had emerged. And while we've seen lots of change since then, perhaps no change so significant as what we're seeing now as a result of technology driving information transparency and connectivity. This revolution is Magna Carta 2.0, and it's changing how corporations and states interact with consumers and citizens all over the world. And I think this change of putting power back into the hands of the people will be required to tackle the problem I discussed. So there are some examples of Magna Carta 2.0 playing out right now in energy, and I'd like to talk to you about those. So in India, 240 million people have no access to electricity, despite enormous progress in recent years. It's a huge problem. And in that context, Pollinate Energy is a social enterprise that is rolling out solar lighting and other sustainable products to over 100,000 people. I like the example because it shows what can be done as well as the size of the challenge. Jump now to Africa, where 800,000 people have had their lives impacted by renewable energy in Mali in Western Africa. And this is due to the great work of the Mali Folk Centre, who are rolling out renewable energy projects on the ground. So think about this. If that's possible in Mali, where only 30% of people have access to electricity in the first place, what's possible here in Australia, where our GDP per capita is 64 times greater, and we have a well-developed electricity system? Well, about an hour from here in Melbourne, there's a community-owned wind farm called Hepburn Wind. They own 2 turbines. Those 2 turbines generate enough electricity every year for 2,000 homes. It's just a wonderful story, and I love the story because I know the challenges of financing, building, and operating wind farms. And I love the example because the company I run is working in partnership with Hepburn Wind to help them develop their goals. Now, you might say, well, look, that sounds good, but how big can this actually be? How much of a contribution can Magna Carta 2.0 make to the world? Well, let's do the maths. So here's Hepburn Wind. It's about an hour from Melbourne, as I mentioned. Within 25 kilometres of that community-owned wind farm, about 25,000 people live. Australia's got a population of 24 million, so if you just do the maths, there are about 1,000 similar-sized communities all across Australia. And by coincidence, there are 1,000 of you here today. So if just 1/4 of those communities were to develop a similar-sized wind or solar farm in their community, we would have added the capacity of a coal-fired power station to the grid. Now think about rooftop solar, which many of you will have. 1.5 million homes across Australia have rooftop solar. And every time we get another 200,000 installations, we add the capacity of a coal-fired power station to the grid. And this revolution won't just be on the supply side. Technology is changing and empowering consumers of energy and electricity more than ever before, as we see that happening in many sectors across the economy. The company I run is making a contribution in this area by trying to provide information and transparency and choice to consumers of electricity where they just did not have that before. So in 1215, King John knew things had to change. We're in a similar position today. And the change today is being driven by technology. And for the first time, large numbers of stakeholders can influence how nations and corporates act. And in fact, there's an enormous opportunity for corporates to go and partner with communities and consumers and stakeholders. And those stakeholders are you, sitting in that chair or watching this video. Now is the time. And if I could share one last idea with you, it is that you have the power to put that into your hands. Now's the time to make a contribution. Get amongst it, because if all of you do, we do stand a chance. Thank you very much.